Good morning, good morning, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our online circle, our final one, actually. I think since we started our journey in March, this has to be the final one that we're doing. And we're so excited that it's on a topic that we are so passionate about in terms of the free trade agreement. I don't know what day we're on lockdown anymore. I've lost count completely. Although I think everybody's excited that we are now on level 3, which I think feels a bit like level 1. So we kind of go with the flow now, but everybody's been let out. And I think today is also a warmer day, which is wonderful. I think last week we all froze. Today, I think we're feeling a bit warmer than we were last week. So welcome everybody. Welcome to this very exciting topic that we are so looking forward to unpacking. Welcome to Claudia and welcome to Trudy, who've so graciously agreed to come and share their insights on this very important policy, which is meant to really, I think, bring to life this Africa Rising narrative of Africa being such a superpower, being such a super economy. And we're excited because we want to have the conversation around how do we make sure that women participate more meaningfully in those spaces. So we're excited also because I think when Rehema and I started this journey many years ago, and we started the conversations around making sure that women are actually in the conversations, but also in the spaces that actually drive economic growth, there was no free trade agreement. And we were so excited when in 2018, it started really coming up as part of our conversations in saying that how do we make sure that this continent, if it trades, I think at the time it was saying if it trades an extra 10% with itself, it could drive significant growth. So welcome to our participants who have joined us this morning. I think there are a lot more that are going to sign on, so we're going to start and they'll get us as we go through. Just a few housekeeping rules before we get on. You're all going to be on mute, except for our speakers at the time for the duration of the webinar. If you can also make sure that your videos is off, but I'm sure that Rehema will ensure that happens in the background, and only the person who is speaking will be on video at the time. If you've got any questions, any comments that you want, please feel free to either use the chat function or the Q&A function, and we'll be sure to pick it up. But I'm so excited about the conversation that we're going to pick up this morning. The free trade agreement was set, I think we're supposed to be beginning to trade under the free trade area in the next 2 weeks. It was supposed to be the 1st of July. But I think given the current operating context that we have, that has been pushed out now, I think to January next year. And we're hoping that still goes ahead. But this free trade area is touted to make Africa the largest economy, I think, next to the World Trade Organization. I think that was the largest agreement that was signed to date. And it's supposed to unlock amazing opportunities for this continent. I'm excited that the conversation that we're going to unpack is going to allow us to get, Claudia is going to give us an overview of exactly what this policy is, what it's meant to enable, where we are in terms of implementation, what some of the challenges are. And together with Trudy, we will have a conversation around where we're at with it, how COVID has begun to impact the free trade. But I think the nice thing about it is I said that, you know, the Japanese word for crisis means on the one side there's danger and on the other side there's opportunity. And I'm hoping that we're beginning to unpack also what are some of the opportunities and also for the women entrepreneurs across the continent in terms of how they can participate. So without delaying any further for this great conversation, I'm going to hand over to Claudia, who's with the DTI and has been very much involved in this policy on this journey, and I think in trade agreements just generally. And then after that, we will then introduce Trudy, who will then take the conversation forward. So thank you very much, Claudia. Welcome. We look forward to what you're going to share with our audience. And please, guys, if you've got any questions, any comments, please keep them coming so that we can keep this conversation an engaging one. Good morning, welcome, and let's go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lebo, and good morning, everybody. It really is a great privilege for me to participate in this conversation. And I like the fact that you call it a conversation because it's something that cannot be static. It's something that we need to engage consistently on, not just on the African continental free trade area, which is clearly a very pertinent topic at the moment. And it offers a lot of potential for African entrepreneurs, especially women. But it's something that women just need to engage in terms of the discussions on trade and economic development that we continue to have these discussions and conversations on a more regular basis as well. So thank you again for the invitation. I'm really grateful for that. And my presentation, which I'll share now on the screen, is ready to provide everyone, just to contextualize the African Continental Free Trade Area, where it came from, what it aims to achieve, and just briefly where we are now in terms of the process. As you clearly mentioned, there have been some delays in terms of the impact of COVID-19, but those are delays. It's not a deterrent to the commitment and the political will that we have to implement the African Continental Free Trade Area. But it definitely requires us to think a little bit out of the box and to be a little bit more innovative in our approach. And I'll explain that now in terms of how we are processing and what we're trying to do to get the process moving forward and to stay on track as much as possible. So I hope everyone will be able to see the presentation, which I will now be able to put on the screen. Just give me a second. Okay, there we go. I think it's clear. I hope it's clear. I hope everyone can see it. And the title of the presentation is really about whether the AfCFTA is a stimulus package for African entrepreneurs. And I don't want to answer that question right now. I would prefer that based on the information that we give you and the discussion that we have with touted and the participants, that is something really that you decide for yourselves. Is the AfCFTA they're going to be the stimulus package for Africa? Is it going to be something that is really going to assist us in moving forward and pursuing our development objectives post COVID-19? So just to give you a little bit of background in terms of African integration objectives, of course, the AfCFTA is not placed in a vacuum. It really speaks to the objectives and the vision of our forefathers of many decades ago about integrating the continent, not just from a policy perspective, but really from an economic perspective as well. Of course, there's political elements to integration, but the economic integration is really what is going to drive Africa's development and potential growth in the decades to come. So it's seen as quite essential to deal with the limitations of small fragmented markets and economies in Africa. Most of the economies are, most of the countries are landlocked. We've got different levels of development. So you can understand that it becomes quite difficult for some of these economies to participate in global trade and even to trade amongst each other. And from previous experience with some of the regional trade agreements that we have in Africa, the approach that South Africa has undertaken, but of course, an approach that has been adopted by the continent as well, is a development integration approach. And that is slightly different to what you would look like in terms of a very straightforward economic approach to a trade agreement, a customs union, for example. But it's really understanding that market integration alone is not going to deal with Africa's fundamental and underlying challenges, that in order for market integration or economic integration to be successful and for the benefits to be mutually shared across all member states, is that you need to prioritize equally the pillars of infrastructure development, which are inadequate if you look at our cross-border trade and infrastructure, as well as underdeveloped production structures. So really prioritizing industrial development equally. So the three pillars essentially of development integration is market integration, infrastructure development, and industrial development as well. Just a little bit of background on where we are with intra-Africa trade. If you look at Africa's share of world trade, it's roughly 3%, and probably now it's even lower. But what is probably more concerning is the level of intra-Africa trade compared to other regions in the world. We normally statistics are normally ranging between 16 to 18% compared to intra-Asian trade at about 52%, North American at 50%, and intra-EU trade at 70% as well. But quite promising is if you look at the low levels of intra-Africa trade, And you understand that part of it is also the ineffective production structures, inadequate production structures, inadequate cross-border infrastructure linkages. And you consider that Africa's exports to the rest of the world are dominated by raw materials. So we're exporting commodities such as oil and minerals, etc. For many African countries, the African market is already quite important. And in fact, it's probably the second most important market for about 25 African countries and the main export market for about 7 African countries as well. For South Africa, the African market, for example, is probably the second most important market behind Europe and China as well. 3/4 of intra-African trade takes place within your regional blocks, so between SADC and EAC and ECOWAS alike. But what is quite promising is that while, if you look at the first bullet, while most of our exports to the rest of the world are driven by commodities, a huge bulk of our exports to the rest of the continent are actually in value-added manufactured products. So the potential to create these regional value chains, the potential to develop our production structures by cooperating with one another is indeed a great benefit for the development of the continent. The strategic importance of Africa to South Africa. If you look at the first bullet speaks to the major export destinations for South Africa, and it's probably quite similar to the rest of the continent, and it's the rest of Africa, the European Union and China, and that combined accounts for about 62% of South Africa's total exports. The African market was a destination for about 26% of South Africa's total exports in 2018. In 2019, over 50% of our exports to Africa were in manufactured products. So it's not raw materials, it's manufactured products, value-added products. But of course, if you look at where our trade arrangements are and in terms of infrastructure linkages, most of our trade, at least 70% of our trade with the rest of the continent is concentrated in the region, in the SADC region. With the key markets being Botswana, Namibia, Mozambique, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. So really South Africa's immediate neighbors. So of course, the key, the AfCFTA, in addition to the regional trading arrangements that we have currently, really provides an opportunity for member states, countries, and economies to start trading more holistically with the rest of the continent instead of just maintaining their current trade relationships within their immediate regional blocks. Some of the key features of the AfCFTA, it sets out a framework, it's a legal framework essentially for tariff liberalization, which is market integration across the African continent, and it focuses on the harmonization of trade-related rules to encourage greater flows of intra-Africa trade and also importantly intra-Africa investment. What is quite a unique feature of the AfCFTA is that we're not going to have a trading arrangement at this stage where you nullify or disregard the regional trading arrangements that exist. In fact, it preserves the current sub-regional arrangements such as SADC and the EAC and ECOWAS, but it's really about trying to make sure that you start trading with, or you establish a trading relationship with those regions or economies that you do not have a preferential trading arrangement with, and to look at some sort of harmonization of trade rules as well. But for South Africa, for example, in SACU, we would continue to trade with our SADC member states and our SADC neighbors under the SADC trade protocol for now. Of course, where there's a legal issue that would prevail in terms of the implementation of the trade arrangements, the AfCFTA agreement would be the prevailing trade agreement in the continent. Quite important about the AfCFTA is the issue of reciprocity, so that you do not have any free riders in this process. But what is quite important is that it also provides a variable pace for liberalization to allow member states to join the AfCFTA when they are ready, to make sure that they are not pushed into a trading relationship that will be problematic for their national development. So member states are allowed to join the AfCFTA when they are ready. And of course, there's special and differential treatment and flexibilities that are an inherent aspect of the trade agreement for LDCs and special economies with special needs. Of course, the objectives of the AfCFTA is to enhance intra-Africa trade and investment through the progressive elimination of tariffs, so that's trade in goods, the rules to manage non-tariff barriers, because as you can quite understand, that tariffs are not the biggest obstacle to trade in Africa. A lot of non-tariff barriers, including infrastructure development, customs arrangements, etc., are equally problematic and a challenge to intra-Africa trade. It looks at facilitation of cooperation on customs, trade facilitation and transit, and also technical barriers to trade and your sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which are essentially your health standards. Quite importantly, it provides legal certainty and predictability of market access in the rest of the continent. And what is quite unique to the AfCFTA is that it has a dispute and settlement mechanism, which is something that does not exist in some of the regional arrangements. So if there is a challenge and one of the member states are not implementing their commitments, you would be able to have recourse as a member state to a dispute settlement to try resolve those trade disputes. It can stimulate Africa's industrial development and employment through the creation of regional value chains, enhancing investor climate, because there will be a protocol on investment as well, and importantly, providing new market access opportunities for South Africa. South Africa, for example, those would lie predominantly in North and West Africa, which we do not have preferential trading arrangements with. Very quickly in terms of where we are, and you will note the amount of, the considerable amount of progress that has been achieved. It may not look like it if you look at the number of years, but if you look at the enormity and the complexity of negotiating a trade agreement amongst 55 African member states, I think that we've actually done we've actually made quite considerable progress in a short amount of time. The negotiations were launched in 2015 in Johannesburg during one of the AU summits. 3 years later, we managed to adopt the legal instruments of the African Free Trade Area in Kigali in Rwanda. And that basically marked the conclusion of the bulk of the legal text on the phase 1 issues. Of course, there are still other phases to the AfCFTA, which we will start with the negotiations on, and I'll explain that a bit later. And in July 2019, we launched the operational phase of the AfCFTA. And really what that meant was that we had reached the number of countries that we needed to operationalize or ratify the agreement, which meant that the agreement came into effect in May 2019. So the agreement is now in effect operational. But that doesn't mean that we're able to trade, and that I think is something that becomes quite confusing when we talk about it. The agreement has entered into force, but we are not yet able to trade. So it's really the legal framework and the provision for us to establish the implementation structures for the AfCFTA, but we haven't concluded some of the outstanding issues to enable us to start trading. At the moment, we've got 54 out of the 55 AU member states that have signed the agreement. Eritrea is still in the process of undertaking its domestic processes to be able to sign. And 20 countries have ratified the AfCFTA. I know that sometimes we talk about 29 countries because Cameroon has been the latest country to conclude their national process for ratification. But I think because of the impact of COVID-19, they have not been able to deposit formally their instrument of ratification with the African Union. So we still count it as 28 formal ratifications at this stage. In terms of the AfCFTA progress continuing, we've concluded the legal architecture of the AfCFTA, and that includes the agreement, the broader framework of the agreement, the protocol on trading goods and its annexes, the protocol on trading services, as well as the protocol on rules and procedures for the settlement of disputes. We've also concluded the adopted modalities for tariff liberalization, which speaks to the protocol on trading goods. And one of the issues that normally comes up and where there's quite a bit of misunderstanding is that there's this perception that when we stop trading, all tariff lines will go to zero. So there will be no tariffs anymore. And you'll recall that I mentioned that there are flexibilities and special and differentiated treatment that is built into this agreement. It's a developmental agreement. It's a trade agreement, but there's a developmental undertone to it as well. So the level of ambition is actually 90% of tariff lines. And then of course there's a differentiation between non-LDCs, such as South Africa, Nigeria, as well as least developed countries that would be given a longer period. So for South Africa, once the agreement, we stopped implementing a schedule of tariff concessions, we would have 5 years, equal installments to liberalize our tariff lines. LDCs would have 10 years. And then the remaining 10% is divided between a 7% sensitive tariff lines that would be liberalized, but it's liberalized over a longer period of time for non-LDCs 10 years and for LDCs 13 years, with the allowance of a 3% exclusion list to protect domestic industries and to enable them to develop so that they're able to open up at a later stage. So importantly, tariff phase down is in equal installments. So it would be 20% cut per annum on the 90% over a 5-year period for South Africa, for example, and other non-LDCs. On the modalities for trading services, of course, we will be negotiating all services sectors, but we need to prioritize in order to make progress. And the 5 services sectors that we have decided to start with, because of the commonality that we share in terms of those services sectors across the continent, is financial, tourism, transport, communication, and professional services. But as I mentioned, we're not able to start trading yet under the AfCFTA, and this is really because the political will has really outpaced our ability at a technical level to do some of the work. So the political will is really there, and I think that's probably going to be one of the key issues to the success of the AfCFTA. But some of the outstanding issues that we have now are the tariff offers. We've started with the exchange of tariff offers. Out of the 28 member states that have ratified, only 11 have submitted their initial offers. Of course, these offers are still linked to our conclusion of rules of origin across a number of chapters, but specifically on sugar, autos, and clothing and textiles that remain to be concluded. You need to understand what rule is being applied. And of course, for us, it's about really prioritizing a made in Africa approach. So if products are readily available and produced in the continent, we would opt for a wholly obtained rule so that we prioritize locally manufactured products that would then have preferences under the AfCFTA. What you want to avoid is products coming in from third parties and enjoying the benefits of the AfCFTA. So those rules still need to be finalized, and of course that will assist in unlocking the type of tariff offers that we would be able to finalize, and the schedule of tariff concessions as well. For trading services, we've got 6 member states that have submitted their offers on trading services in those 5 priority sectors. And of course, once we start negotiating some of these tariff offers, we'll verify the offers, and then they will translate then into schedules of services commitments and tariff liberalization that would be adopted by heads of state, and that's what would be implemented by member states. Of course, we had the 1st of July deadline for operationalizing the AfCFTA for the start of trading. This was significantly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and resulted in a suspension of some of the negotiating meetings. We are now at the level of ministers of trade trying to look at a redefined roadmap for the negotiations and for the implementation of the commitments. And of course, we're going to be trying to do trade negotiations amongst 55 member states in virtual means. And we will see how far we can get to that. But of course, there will be substantial delays in terms of us concluding now some of the outstanding work on trading goods, trading services, and rules of origin as well. The negotiations on the phase 2 issues, which include the investment, intellectual property, and competition protocols, have also been delayed as a result of the suspension of the meetings. But we also hope to resume these towards the end of the year for finalization by sometime next year in terms of the legal text being finalized. Some of the risks and challenges from the attributed to the AfCFTA, as you can agree, negotiating with 55 member states is already quite difficult. We've got different levels of development, different interests, and it's really about balancing and finding a common ground in ensuring that national interests are protected, but with the broader objective of integrating the continent and Africa's broader development as well. With most of the, especially the trading goods arrangement, we would negotiate as customs unions. South Africa is part of the Southern African Customs Union, so we negotiate as a bloc. With ECOWAS, they would also be negotiating as a customs union as well as the EAC. The challenge that we would have there is, although Nigeria has already signed, they have not ratified. So this would have an impact on ECOWAS's participation in the negotiations. Similarly, in SACU, we also have Lesotho and Botswana that haven't ratified yet. So this would also have an impact on our ability to implement a schedule of tariff concessions. So there's all these dynamics that have an impact and pose significant threats and challenges to the implementation of the AfCFTA. And of course, with any trade agreement, if you look at any trade agreement worldwide, any trade liberalization process will produce gains and losses in production, trade, and employment as a result of revenue losses. But how we manage these gains and losses is really what's going to be the ultimate key to the sustainability of the agreement and its implementation. If the agreement only benefits some of your key economies or your bigger economies like South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, the AfCFTA is never going to work. There will be no interest in it, and Africa's integration from a market perspective will not yield any benefit. So it's really about making sure that we bring everybody on board and that we help one another to achieve these objectives. So there can't just be winners and losers. We really need to be able to share the benefits and the costs of the implementation of the AfCFTA. And of course, I mentioned the risk of transshipment, and this is really about third-party products from other economies outside of the AfCFTA, having preferential access to our domestic markets. So the enforcement of rules of origin are going to be key. And of course, this requires effective capacity to monitor and enforce these rules at the ports of entry. So we're working quite closely with our customs authority to make sure that we are able to develop systems that would assist in monitoring this more effectively. But of course, it requires cooperation between our customs authorities across the continent to ensure that we do this equally well. Just in terms of South Africa's chairship of the African Union commencing in February 2020 until next year, February, one of the key issues that the South Africa announced when it assumed chairship in February was a new decade of African women's financial and economic inclusion from 2020 to 2030. And this was really based on the importance of the African Continental Free Trade Area, the importance of market and economic integration, and with the understanding of post the first decade of women's financial inclusion, that we still have the challenges of limited access of finance for women, leadership, and women in decision-making institutions. So what the AUC, the African Union, is now busy working on is trying to develop a roadmap and implementation modalities to address the challenges of limited participation of women in African trade, African economies, and in leadership positions as well. And what we really need to look at is have these conversations more regularly to improve the role of women in Africa's trade, look at where we can create and tap into regional value chains, identify opportunities, but also understanding the challenges that women experience and how we more vigorously attack and address some of these challenges as well. And of course, what we need to do is, and I'm glad that I see participants from other countries as well on this conversation this morning, is how do we enhance the collaboration between entrepreneurs in South Africa and Nigeria and Kenya? How do we enhance the collaboration between women that are already participating in trade, that can share some of the experiences, challenges, and success stories, and collaborate with regional and continental women-based organizations such as the Pan-African Women Organization, and also tie into some of the policy making and implementation processes that exist by working, for example, with the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. So there's a lot of scope that exists for us to improve the role of women in trade, but it really requires that we think out of the box as women as well, to understand what our needs are and exactly how we're going to unlock these opportunities that exist in a number of trade agreements. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that overview, Claudia. I think it was quite insightful, at least to, you know, for I think sometimes we take for granted what is understood around what this free trade area means, where we are with it, and what actually the practicalities of it are. So thank you very much for that overview, for also highlighting some of the challenges that we do experience. And I think we have a question on here, which we can delve into after Trudy's presentation, around what exactly are the opportunities that exist for women, etc. And I think you've already started highlighting what those priority sectors are, and perhaps we can start having a conversation around what some of the experiences are, some of the women here. And also by ending off your presentation around the fact that, yes, it is the decade of the women. I think at Womenomics Africa, we started the conversation because we were very clear that women need to be driving economic growth on the continent. It's about time we show them how it's really done. And so I think opening that up and talking about what it is, some of the considerations for women, and how we need to come together and collaborate and make sure that the voice of women is heard in these spaces, I think is important. So thank you for that. And I think it's a great segue into Trudy. Trudy, who joins us from TRALEC, and TRALEC's expertise is around the trade agreements across the continent, and understanding where those are. And she's going to be giving us a strong perspective around where exactly we are with that trade agreement, what some of those implications are, particularly given where we are with COVID, and also what some of those opportunities are. So thank you very much, Trudy. Over to you, and then we'll get into the Q&A. I see people have already got some questions, but we can get into that after this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lebo, and good morning, everyone. A great pleasure to be with you. I will just share with you my presentation. And thank you so much to Claudia for the comprehensive overview that she has provided on the African Continental Free Trade Area. Just before I start, I'd like to pick up on a couple of points that Claudia and Lebo have mentioned. I think Claudia referred to the number of least developed countries in Africa, and I think this is really an important reminder of not only the challenges that we face, but also the opportunities for the AfCFTA to contribute to enhancing not only trade outcomes, but much broader development outcomes for so many African countries. We're reminded, of course, that of the global 47 LDCs, 33 are African, and 14 of them are landlocked. So this just gives us an idea of the fragmentation of the continent and the particular development challenges, the asymmetry that the AfCFTA is hoping to address. It's very difficult to integrate unequal partners, but as Claudia has indicated, there are a number of provisions within the agreement which are designed specifically to help the smaller, the lesser developed, the landlocked, and the island economies that we have to think about as well in this particular context. Very briefly, when we take a look at the African Continental Free Trade Area, Claudia has reminded us that this is a free trade agreement, and at minimum, a free trade agreement has to have a plan for the liberalization of tariffs, tariff reduction on a reciprocal basis among member states, and also the adoption of rules of origin. And the rules of origin are really the national determination of origin of a particular product. So what is the national origin of the product? And the aim is, of course, that we want to promote intra-Africa trade. So rules of origin become extremely important to prevent transshipment or trade deflection, as economists like to call it, where goods coming from a third party can actually slip through in to get the benefit of those lower tariffs, which we have spent a great deal of time negotiating once the agreement becomes fully operational. But I want to focus on the fact that the African Continental Free Trade Area, in addition to being a free trade area, is also a flagship project of the African Union. A reminder that there are a number of flagship projects, 14 or 15, and they include a focus on industrial development, the Accelerated Industrial Development for Africa Plan, AIDA, program focusing on infrastructure development, PIDA, and a program, a long-standing program on agricultural development, CARDIP, the mining vision, science and technology innovation strategy, and of course, the flagship program which really motivated for the expeditious establishment of the AfCFTA, BIAT, boosting intra-Africa trade. And it's in this second life of the AfCFTA that we find the opportunity to address some of the fundamental challenges associated with expanding and diversifying our productive capacity. At this stage, Claudia is absolutely right. We export commodities and we import manufacturers. It is true that South Africa, for example, exports a lot of manufactured products to the rest of Africa, but many of them do not have the productive capacity to be able to export industrial goods, manufactured consumer goods yet. We need to expand our productive capacity to produce tradable goods and also services competitively on the continent. And that will require synergy between the AfCFTA as a free trade agreement and then as a flagship project along with the other flagship projects. So this is where we can see very exciting opportunities. Currently, during this COVID pandemic, we're seeing a lot of focus on the development of Africa's pharmaceutical industry. There is a strategy to develop the pharmaceutical industry already in place, but we can give it a great deal of impetus now. And also when we're negotiating tariff liberalization, we should be focusing on tariff reduction, in particular, for example, as far as pharmaceutical products, medical equipment, protective personal equipment is concerned, because we are starting to produce those products on the continent as a response to COVID-19. This is just a representation of these flagship projects, which really form part of the blueprint, the development blueprint for the African continent, Agenda 2063. And I would like to emphasize this synergy, which is particularly important among these different initiatives. They form part of our continental development strategy, and that's really important. This is just to confirm, as Claudia has indicated, this is a barometer of where we stand with implementation, ratification of the agreement. 54 member states have signed, 28 have deposited their instruments of ratification. There are 2 others, Democratic Republic of the Congo and Cameroon, that have completed the domestic processes, taken the agreement for approval to Parliament, but have not yet taken their letter of ratification to the African Union Commission in Addis. This is a list of when the countries have ratified, so we can have a look at those later. But the real question then is, where will the benefits of the AfCFTA come from for African entrepreneurs? And I would like also to ask that question specifically: where will the benefits for women entrepreneurs come from, and for young women entrepreneurs? Because if we take a look at marginalized communities, not only in the productive space, but also in the policy-making space, then women and youth are definitely 2 of the most important groups who are marginalized in those 2 very interconnected spaces, which can bring success to the AfCFTA implementation process. Just a reminder, when we take a look at where the benefits are going to come from, the regional economic communities such as SADC will continue to exist. So we will, as South Africa and South African entrepreneurs, continue to trade with our trading partners in the SADC region under the SADC rules. And a reminder that given that we have a very low level of intra-Africa trade still at this stage, it's between 16, 17, 18%, depending on the year we have a look at. This is for 2017, for 2018, it's pretty similar. More than 50% of that intra-Africa trade takes place here within the Southern African Customs Union region. In fact, if we look at South Africa's trade globally, these 2 small countries, Botswana and Namibia, count among our top 10 trading partners globally. And more than 65% of intra-Africa trade takes place amongst the SADC member states. It's not rocket science to conclude that South Africa plays a key role in driving intra-Africa trade. We have significant advantages related to our economic size, our level of development as compared with others, but also the diversification, the quality of our infrastructure, services, and so on, do give us an advantage to really springboard into parts of the continent where we do not yet have trade agreements. And Claudia mentioned West Africa, North Africa, and Central Africa. So these are regions which the AfCFTA potentially can open up significant opportunities for our entrepreneurs. This, colleagues, is just a depiction of the regional economic communities that exist. 8 of them are recognized by the African Union as building blocks of the AfCFTA. SACU is not one of those, but I've put it in here because it is such an important one when we look at intra-Africa trade. But this gives us just a status update on the regional economic communities that exist already. So when we look at this slide in particular, these are the countries with whom South Africa, as part of SACU and SADC, do not yet have trade agreements. So we can have a look, if we overlay these maps, it is a very large part of the continent that we do not yet have trade agreements with. So there are significant opportunities, but we also recognize that it will not only be tariff liberalization that opens those opportunities. The distance factor and a range of factors associated with trade facilitation, with trade transaction costs, transport regulation will have to be addressed if these become effective opportunities for our entrepreneurs. There's also an initiative which is currently underway, and I think this we have to factor into our conversation about the African Continental Free Trade Area. South Africa, as part of SACU, is also participating in the negotiations to conclude the tripartite free trade area. And this is an initiative which predates the AfCFTA. Our heads of state of these 26 member states in SADC, East African Community, and the Common Market for East and Southern Africa made this decision in October 2008 that we should integrate this entire East and Southern African region. Negotiations were launched, and where we stand at the moment is that the SACU member states and the East African Community member states have concluded their tariff negotiations in July last year. There are a few rules of origin issues to be sorted, and it's no surprise that it is in the same areas where we are still negotiating under the AfCFTA: clothing and textile, sugar, edible oils, and the automotive sector. Those rules of origin are difficult because we all have interests in developing our particular domestic industries that are part of our development strategies, and therefore to some extent we compete a little bit with one another. This agreement that is being negotiated is also anchored on the 3 pillars of the development integration paradigm that Claudia outlined. So this we have to factor in, because we will not negotiate with the member states in the East African Community under the AfCFTA if this is already almost complete. So this is a summary, just colleagues, of who South Africa is a member of SACU. As Claudia mentioned, we have to negotiate with our fellow customs union member states. We will negotiate, for example, with the member states of ECOWAS. And of course, the big player in that regional economic community is Nigeria. Nigeria offers significant opportunities, but it is hedging its bets. It has signed the agreement, but signature brings no legal obligations. They are waiting to ratify because, of course, their private sector called the executive back from the March 2018 summit when the AfCFTA was presented for signature and said, wait, we have to consider very, very carefully. We need a comprehensive consultative process with private sector and non-state actors before we commit to the African Continental Free Trade Area. So we wait to see what happens there. The Central African Economic and Monetary Union, this is also a customs union. There are important opportunities in countries in that regional economic community as well. So very important to think about the question, who will we negotiate with? And it's so important, I know DTIC is engaging with the private sector to try to understand what opportunities our entrepreneurs see in these countries already, so that we can frame a coherent and effective negotiating strategy. In addition to the flagship projects, there are a number of support initiatives, colleagues, which from an entrepreneur's perspective are absolutely critical, that have been designed specifically to support the AfCFTA. Africa's Export-Import Bank, AfricSimBank, which is headquartered in Cairo in Egypt, is rolling out a number of extremely important initiatives. It has announced a $1 billion adjustment facility. This is for those countries that will be dealing with revenue losses when they liberalize tariffs or other adjustment costs. Claudia reminded us that in a process of liberalization like this, there are winners and losers. And so this facility that has been put up by the AfricSimBank is an extremely important one to assist member states that will be seriously adversely affected in particular sectors, for example, to get adjustment support. But AfricSimBank is also working in an area which we traditionally don't associate with a finance institution. They are rolling out support to quality assurance centers. Now, this is to strengthen the capacity of institutions which are responsible for the testing and accreditation of standards standards related to food and agricultural products, for example, to protect human, plant, animal health and the environment. This is absolutely critical. I think we only need to think back to our own experience not so long ago with listeriosis to remember how important standards are generally, but also in international trade. So this is an area of support which is absolutely critical. It can improve our competitiveness, the quality of the products for consumers across the continent. There is also, and again, AfCFTA, together with a number of partners, is involved in establishing a pan-African payments and settlement system. Entrepreneurs who are trading on the continent often note the fact that the cost of financial transactions, the foreign exchange risks, the clearing costs, which most often is done globally, not on the African continent, become really important inhibitive factors that they have to consider. So if we have our own continental payments and clearance system, this will reduce the transaction costs for entrepreneurs considerably. So this, there's been a little bit of a delay in enrolling and establishing this, but extremely important for cross-border payments and eliminating foreign exchange risks. The practical question also has to be asked, and this comes to a number of areas which impact women very, very directly. And when we ask what really inhibits intra-Africa trade, a picture such as this tells 1,000 stories. This was taken in December 2018, and during COVID, we understand that the queues of trucks has grown to 30, 40 kilometers at some border posts. This, colleagues, has to be addressed as well. And this is the broad trade facilitation agenda, which includes more effective customs and border management, takes a look at digital trade solutions, and we are learning a lot from the COVID experience, which can be extremely useful for the effective implementation of the AfCFTA. But we also have to note that if we improve trade facilitation, if we have digital solutions and customs and border management is improved, that improves our trade not only with partners on the continent, but with global trade partners as well. So it's a win-win situation in terms of improving our competitiveness. What about some of the fundamental issues? And here I really want to note that COVID-19 and the pause that it has brought to the negotiations should not necessarily be seen as a completely negative setback for the AfCFTA. I think it is extremely important that we use this pause, this COVID-19 pause, to reflect on some of the fundamental issues and to ask really important questions about whether the AfCFTA, as it is now, cannot be improved in many areas. And the fact that we're even able to ask this question is important because the AfCFTA is a member-driven initiative. The member states, our heads of state and government, can make decisions to add new issues to the agenda, even at this stage. And of course, there is the whole implementation agenda, which still has to be developed. So when we take a look at the legal instruments that have been concluded, we have not yet developed comprehensive implementation strategies to give effect to those particular provisions in the agreement. We've got opportunities to make sure that this agreement truly contributes to a better trade environment for women, for youth, and that it also addresses fundamental challenges such as climate. COVID-19 is a crisis, but colleagues, it will not be the only crisis we see on the continent. We've almost forgotten the floods in Mozambique not so long ago, 2 floods which hit that east southern coast of the African continent not so long ago and caused absolute devastation. There will be more of these to come. How can we collectively leverage the AfCFTA and its institutions to be able to have a collective, coordinated response to crises that will come our way? So the kind of questions I want to ask here, the first question is a very important one, and it impacts particularly small traders. Many regional economic communities, such as COMESA and others, have a simplified trade regime, which means that for small traders who are trading on a daily basis, informal cross-border traders, but also small traders who are doing multiple trips per month or per week across a particular border post, have a simplified trade regime, which has simplified documentation, less stringent requirements to meet, and therefore reduces the costs of doing business. This is so important. And during COVID, what we've seen is that there are huge numbers of families, millions of families, not only in border communities, much broader areas, that are dependent on small traders and informal cross-border traders. This is something that I would say we really have to bring onto the AfCFTA agenda. Has been discussed to some extent, but no commitment has yet been made. Will the implementation of the annexes related to customs and border management address the specific concerns of women traders? What about facilities at border posts? What about energy? What about lighting? What about facilities for data protection and a whole range of issues, ablution facilities? What are we going to do about that? Where will the benefits for the youth come from? And we often associate young entrepreneurs with the important developments in the digital economy, trade and services, ICT, e-commerce, and so on. What are the specific provisions which will open up opportunities in these areas for the youth and for women in particular? And then finally, what about climate and other crises? Concluding remarks, just as I was preparing to join the webinar this morning, I received this in my email. It's an open letter for a number of women leaders on our continent. Gracia Machel, our candidate from Nigeria for the position of Director General at the World Trade Organization, Dr. Ngozi, Dr. Vera Songwe, and of course, South Africa's Maria Ramos. And what it is saying is that the COVID-19 experience has unearthed massive inequalities within our societies, and particularly raised and brought to light the unique burdens which women carry the world over. We need a collective response. Let's take up the call that they are making today and address those issues, not only in the context of the AfCFTA, but in the broader development agenda for our nation states, for our regional economic communities, and also for the broader Agenda 2063. What are the lessons from COVID? Undeniably, COVID-19 has taught us that we are interconnected. If one country closes its border, its neighbors and countries along the trade corridors are immediately affected. We've seen livelihoods of millions, and livelihoods that are driven and supported primarily by women, in many, many cases, immediately cut off as a result of border closures. And in many cases, unfortunately, colleagues, these border closures have happened without consultation with neighboring countries or at regional economic community level. This cannot happen again. We are interconnected, and what we do as a sovereign state impacts our neighbors and neighboring countries further along the trade corridors. Trade facilitation matters. We have to rethink how we manage our border posts. If it is possible during the pandemic to have an e-certificate of origin, that should become standard practice. We can't revert to paper after this. How do we manage import and export permits? Export and import permits have been instituted on a number of essential products, PPE, protective personal equipment, on medicines, and many, many other products, also on food. If we're not effectively managing those permits, we are causing delays and impacting, for example, food security in neighboring countries. At one stage, the International Trade Administration Commission was indicating on its website that it needed 10 days to process a permit. Colleagues, that's a very, very long time when we're thinking about food security in neighboring countries. Services regulation. Although we are talking about frameworks for regulatory cooperation, we might have to go further. Harmonization of certain regulations may well be extremely important. And just one example will provide a sense of how important harmonization can be. If we have different axle load limits in two countries on either side of a border post, so in one country the carrying capacity on the road is 40 tons, across the border it's 30 tons, we've got a problem. No amount of cooperation will solve the fact that a particular truck may have to shed 10 tons of its load when it moves across the border. Harmonization, we need to consider really, really strategically, very, very important. The foundational, fundamental issues that COVID has highlighted, trade and gender, trade and sustainable development. Colleagues, these have become standard chapters in most modern free trade agreements. We don't have them yet in the AfCFTA, but it is possible to put them on the agenda because after all, it's a member-driven initiative and the member states can decide to do that. Just my final slide, colleagues, is just when it comes back to the tariff negotiations, which we have just started. This is just a little bit of an overview of some of the tariffs that our exports into the continent face, but also, of course, that exporters from neighboring countries across the continent face into South Africa. If we're exporting apples to Nigeria, the import duty is 20%. That puts us at a huge disadvantage with global exporters to Nigeria. Raw cane sugar into Kenya, 100% duty. That's huge. So this gives us some idea. Of course, when it comes to clothing and textiles, there are some items of clothing. If we're importing them into South Africa or SACU, the import duty is 45%. We need to have a look at some of these tariffs in our negotiations, both in terms of protecting our domestic interests, but also in terms of opening up particular opportunities across the continent. Thank you so much, colleagues.
Thank you so much for that, Trudy. I was faced with a facilitator's dilemma in consuming such great content, with the need to obviously bear in mind that time is pressing upon us. But that was really, really great insights, shared a really holistic perspective of what COVID-19 means, but also other areas of application, limitations, and participation in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, in the free trade area. So what I would like to do at this point in time, we appreciated when we set up this discussion that there is no way we are going to cover all matters. In fact, even when we were having our preparatory conversations, it was very clear that this was going to be a conversation that was meant to stimulate additional context. And it was also meant to essentially lay a grounding, a firm ground upon which the audience can appreciate what it is we're talking about when we're referring and referencing the African Continental Free Trade area. There are a number of points that you've raised, and we'd like to bring some of the other voices into the room. And so I'm just going to go to the Q&A and not ask my questions, just so that we can hear, and some of the questions that have been asked by the participants have an opportunity to be aired. There's Anonymous who asks, and there was one of the slides, Trudy, that you had shared, basically of the different continental agreements or country agreements such as your SACU, such as your SADC, well, you mentioned them slightly differently, ECOWAS, ECAS, and what you'd highlighted, for instance, in one of them was that South Africa, for example, doesn't have agreements with a lot of those. Anonymous asks, will South Africa be negotiating bilaterally tariff agreements and negotiations with the regions that it does not have arrangements with? And secondly, given the amount of time it has taken to negotiate with the regions or countries under the TFTA, is it realistic that trading will be possible by 2021 under the new AfCFTA?
Thank you so much. That's a really interesting question. I think Claudia will be able to help us here as well. She reminded us that, of course, we negotiate with our customs union members because we have a common external tariff. So whether a t-shirt comes into Namibia or South Africa, the duty is the same. So very important, we will negotiate SACU with ECOWAS, SACU with the Central African Economic and Monetary Union, and so on. There will be some individual countries that we negotiate bilaterally with. As far as the time is concerned, I think this is a concern for us, but I know that member states, and this certainly is the case in South Africa, we've been doing a lot of work, literally over the past year or more, engaging with business associations and so on. So, and there is enormous political will to get the agreement functional as soon as possible. But what can happen is that we can do what the trade economists would call a variable geometry approach, so that we can stage those who are ready can start trading and move on. So we can have an incremental approach, but maybe Claudia could help us there as well. Thanks, Rahima.
Awesome. Claudia?
Thanks for that excellent question. And I think Trudy basically covered it really, really well. It's always a concern that we have in these negotiations. If you look at the initial timeframes when they said you need to have an AfCFTA concluded by 2017, no one in the world, including in Africa, thought that we were able to do it. And we were 3 months short of concluding the legal text. It's not impossible. It's going to be really difficult. But as Trudy mentioned, we've already done a lot of the groundwork. We've been negotiating from the very beginning and consulting with business and labor in this process to identify where our offensive interests are, where our defensive interests are. And the same process has been undertaken at other regional levels as well. So when we say that we still need to negotiate the tariff offers, it doesn't mean that we have not started with any process. A lot of work has been done at the national level. A lot of work has been done at the continental level. But of course, what is at the moment quite a huge impediment to the finalization of these are the rules of origin. It's very difficult to make a commitment to say, I'm going to liberalize this tariff line or this chapter when I don't know what the applicable rule of origin is. So even in terms of how we sequence the negotiations, as I mentioned, we're looking at a revised roadmap to enable us to conclude some of this outstanding work. It's important that the sequencing is right. So if we don't try to finalize some of the rules of origin before we finalize these tariff offers, then we're going to probably have a reduced level of ambition in terms of our tariff offers, which is not something that we want to see in the continent. So it's not impossible, but it is certainly going to be a challenge if we're not able to conclude some of the outstanding work. Thanks.
Awesome. I think in recognition of time, I'd asked the participants for an additional 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, and we're already at the end of that, which again affirms what we picked up, Claudia and Trudy and Lebo, that this conversation definitely needs a lot more time. However, I'd be remiss not to bring up the conversation around women in this conversation as we close. We are entering, and we've just entered the second decade of the woman. We make a lot of brouhaha about how it's the decade of the women and how women are going to be impacted. I think it was you, Trudy, who made a comment about, I think the Nigerians basically asking their commission to come back and have a conversation as to what the implications are locally. Are we seeing sufficient interaction, particularly with business, particularly with women in business, to participate and to understand what the AfCFTA is going to bring about, what the implications are, and importantly, how women can participate more effectively in this free trade area? Are there any deliberate moves to incorporate and include women beyond what is written on paper? What is on the ground that facilitates women's engagement in the AfCFTA?
If I could quickly come on there, Rahima, I think the answer is not enough. I think there are good examples of where women business associations have been particularly active, and Kenya is one of those countries where women traders organizations have voice and participate actively in the consultation processes and so on. But unfortunately, this is not true across the continent. And I think this is something that we have to look at, not only for the AfCFTA, but going forward. I think a very important initiative that's currently underway is the establishment of an African Business Council, so a continent-wide business association. But as far as I understand, there is no discussion yet about how women and women's concerns in the trade and broader economic environment will be accommodated within that institutional arrangement. So this is an area where I really would encourage all of us to be proactive and to make contact with our Apex business organizations, which will be the members, our regional business organizations, which will also be members of the ABC. But for now, it really is up to us to take the initiative and to go to the focal point. In South Africa, that's DTIC. The Department of Trade and Industry and Competition negotiates on our behalf. They coordinate also with our SACU member states. So this is a particular area for us to have a look at. The other area I want to emphasize is that just as we are underrepresented in the private sector, we are also seriously underrepresented in the policy-making arena. And if we are not at the table where policy decisions are being made, our issues will not make it onto the agenda. So it's extremely important that we engage with women policy makers. And we really have a sterling supporter of this agenda, obviously, in Claudia. But there are other women across other departments in agriculture, in communications and the services sectors that are represented by the line ministries, where we can have voice and whom we can lobby to take issues on board. So I think we've also got to be creative about how we get to making sure that the issues that matter for us actually get to that policy arena. Thank you.
Awesome. Claudia, Trudy, I'm going to ask you for some, sorry, Trudy. Claudia, I'm going to ask you for some closing remarks.
Thanks so much. And I agree, this is a conversation that you're not going to have all the answers in an hour session. So it's important for us to really tap into those issues that we need to expand on. And I can assure you there's other areas in the DTI that really provide that kind of support. I saw some of the questions in the Q&A that I haven't been able to respond to. But I'm happy to engage through you or directly with some of the participants in answering some of those questions. So you're welcome to share my contact details as well. But just in terms of the role of women, I agree with Trudy, we haven't done enough. We haven't done enough to bring our youth, to create opportunities for our youth, to give them a voice. But colleagues, this is something that it's unprecedented. We are learning by doing. And we rely on feedback, we rely on these kind of engagements. But again, as I mentioned, and Trudy also tapped into that, let's just be proactive. We can't rely on someone else to make those opportunities available to us. We also need to be quite proactive in identifying what it is that we need and where it is that we want to be as women. There's a lot of policy making arenas that we can influence policymakers, engaging through your business associations, engaging through NEDLAC, which I'm probably putting my head on the block for saying this, but if you look at the participation in NEDLAC, the representation of women is very low or almost non-existent. So really about how do we address it within our own business associations to improve the role of women in these policy making domains, to engage more actively with government. You can hold government accountable by engaging with them, but we are not always aware of what the needs and the interests of women or any sector are if there isn't that kind of engagement. And we're happy to engage with you at the DTIC to look at those opportunities and to address the challenges that may be needed. But also at the regional and continental level, there's a number of regional associations, there's a number of continental associations. The African Union has a specific platform where women issues are discussed. Of course, it's headed by government, but trying to understand what those issues are, what is on the domain and the discussion, and also engaging, finding an opportunity which the DTI can assist in the implementation of the agreement. How do we maximize those opportunities? And how do we work with continental bodies in implementing those opportunities for women as well? Thanks.
Awesome, thank you so much, Claudia. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've come to the end of the session. We'd like to acknowledge that there are questions that haven't been answered. We will attempt to send these in a follow-up email that we always send after the session. We appreciate that there's a number of different questions that have come up that stimulate additional conversations and additional platforms. We have taken this into consideration. Both Claudia and Trudy have said to us that they are also on board in terms of fashioning something that comes out of this, because we can see that it is something that needs to happen. In this session, we had a mission to eliminate a background to the AfCFTA, to basically demonstrate what the phased approach to implementation has done and what the process is. Wanted to identify the key markets and sectors that are likely to benefit and what the AfCFTA as a legal agreement and instrument facilitates. We also wanted to understand the impact of COVID-19 on the AfCFTA and regional trade. We've been able to do that, highlight that. We recognize that there's deeper, stronger conversations to have at Womenomics Africa. We are committed to making sure that African women are participating and are at the driving force behind its implementation and its beneficiation. And we will strive and continue to facilitate platforms that allows us to not just engage, identify where the money is, and make sure that the African woman is at the back of that money when it's being receipted. Ladies and gentlemen, we will also be providing you with slides as part of what you're going to get. So after the session, you will get slides, you will get a link to the video that we will be the recording of this session, and feel free to engage us on events@womenomics.net if you've got any questions and queries. Thank you so much for being part of this session, part of the series. Over to my partner Lebo, she's got any last words. It's been a great part facilitating these sessions. And we'd like to thank Solidaridad, who's been our partner in terms of facilitating this process to be able to be possible, as well as African Aurora Business Network in Ghana, who's our partner, Womenomics Africa ambassadors in Ghana. Lebu.
On the spot. Thank you very much. Thank you to our speakers today, but also thank you to those that have continuously joined us on this journey. We've had a number of people that have been consistent participants on this series that we started, but I think it also highlighted why we started the journey, which was really around saying, how do we create a space that, yes, we can illuminate conversations, but also that we can facilitate a space that women can collaborate better and identify opportunities where they can do stuff together. So we're looking forward to the online series, or the Womenomics series 2.0, because this part of it has really unpacked and identified where we need to be doing more of, but also more importantly in the work that Rehema and I do, which is saying, how do we capacitate women and work with them to develop the skills to participate in these opportunities that we highlight in this series. So look forward to some of the developments that we'll be sharing with you over the next couple of weeks. Part of it will be around this conversation, but part of it will be around the program, around how do we work with women to actually scale them up to participate in these spaces. So thank you to everybody. Have a fabulous, fabulous Monday. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Trudy, for coming on board. We look forward to more conversations with you and engaging with you more. Enjoy level 3 and go out. Thank you.
Cheers, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.